Welcome to the summer edition of the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast.
How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin, and how do you develop the mindset and skill set to be successful? Welcome, everyone, to the Sprint to Success with Design Thinking podcast. I'm your host, Saba Kidwai. Join me each week as I share the stories and strategies from the world's leading researchers and practitioners about why they believe the answer lies in practicing design thinking.
In public school, we are often trying to find ways to reach students, to engage them differently, especially during some remote learning absences where kids are outside of our building at 100%. 20%-ish of my students, we live in rural Wisconsin. They don't have access to the internet or to a cell phone Wi-Fi hotspot type of gear. So one thing I'd like to see is in the higher ed world too, like what other options are there for presenting your research? Does it always have to be in a dissertation? Could it be a podcast that isn't just whipped together by Jeff and Adam? Could there be some other parameters to show what we've learned, to demonstrate the knowledge that we've learned from others and from our research? And, maybe we should forward this on to somebody, Jeff, that can make those changes or something. Or maybe Saba's the right person.
Hey.
I just always think that we get chastised for not changing enough here. And I wonder if others are thinking the same thing in different realms. I don't work in a different realm, so you'll have to spearhead that, Saba. So next week we want answers. Or not.
I think it's interesting. I think it's one of the things that I feel like that's why that cross-industry collaboration is so essential, because I think a lot of people at the end of the day just don't know what they don't know. And it's hard to do it all alone. It was another really big takeaway from the work at Design 39. What truly differentiated them was their culture of collaboration. Like this idea, they had this really beautiful line where they used to say that when we come to the table to start a project, we ask each other, what are you energized by? Like, what are your strengths and how do we leverage your strengths and what energizes you as we begin this work? Now, does that mean that you never have to do anything that you don't want to? Of course not. Like we all have those things, but why have somebody focus on something that isn't a strength when they could be applying that in another area because we're collaborating together and somebody else brings that strength to the table. So I think the more like podcasts like this, and it's why I always love what you guys are doing and, seeing people like this and supporting these initiatives, because the more those stories are out there, the more chances there are that people will listen and lean in and just be curious. That's what these stories do, right? They make you curious about what's possible. They make you want to learn more and things like that.
Sure.
Hey, Jeff, before I take her down, my last question before your last question, what did her comments, who does that remind you of about focusing on our strengths?
Dave Rendell.
Seriously. I mean, it's way back, what, episode 15, 20, 25, something like that. It's amazing when we hear that from other leaders or the thought leaders. It's really the same thing, but I'm not really doing it as a principal. I'm still not focusing on that. We don't look at those. What is the strength of the person coming in? We look to fill a void and try to fit in that hole. So anyway, it's a challenge. We'll have to keep looking at it. Speaking of challenges, maybe opportunities, Saba, what kind of leadership struggles or opportunities have you faced to get you to where you are today? If you have any. I mean, Jeff and I have a lot of struggles we face, but maybe you've got none.
No, I feel like, so first of all, there's no, it never ends, right? No matter what stage you're at or where you're at, there's always a different struggle at a different point in time. I would say, when I shared with you the example of USC, that was huge. I had never really had a formal leadership role like that before, where I was actually fully in charge of starting from scratch, building something up. And so it's really that listening and learning. But the one thing I can say, no matter what leadership challenge that emerges, I feel like the one reason I gravitate so deeply to that cultures of innovation begin with a culture of empathy. Innovation isn't just technology. Innovation means we're trying to change something. We're trying to create something that meets the needs of the current time we're living in or whatever it is that we're designing for. And so I feel like no matter what your leadership challenge is, this is my go-to. What are people's fears and what are people's motivations? I think a lot of times when we think about empathy, we focus on people's problems, but we don't really focus in on okay, but what do they want? What are their goals? What excites them? What motivates them? And I think if you can understand those two things about the people that you're working with, about the people that you're leading, about the people that you're serving, whatever people you're designing for. I think if you can begin to have an understanding of those two elements, you can begin to craft a narrative, whether it's a visionary narrative or whether it's an email that is going to speak to that person in their language. I think that's what the empathy thing does as well, in terms of like when I have leadership challenges, it helps me learn what your language is that you're using so that I can articulate in a way that's perhaps meaningful to you, that's going to bring you into the conversation. I actually interviewed one of my favorite speakers on this. Her name is Bree Groff. And she actually used to be an educator as well. She was a middle school science teacher. And then she later went on into the corporate side, as organizational change now. But she says people don't resist change. They resist loss of time, loss of narrative, loss of competency. These are all the things. She's like, it's like grief. And until you don't address that grief, you can't move forward. And I think especially right now, people are dealing with a lot of loss. Like, it is not an easy time to be a leader. It's not an easy time to be anybody right now. But I think that empathy lens just helps us take a step back at a time when there's a lot of pressure to come up with a lot of answers, and make sure that we're asking the right questions so that we can generate the journey towards the right answers.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So much there. I mean, it's so critical, and I hope our listeners are really focusing in on that and understanding. Don't focus on necessarily the problems. Really listen to what are people's fears and motivations, to paraphrase what you said. I think that's so critical. And I think a lot of times we're really bad at that because we don't listen. Someone once asked me in an interview, if I could speak to my younger self about what I know now. And no, Adam, it wasn't when I turned 50, even though I know a lot more.
No, they said younger self.
I'm really smart now. So, but they asked me, like, what would you tell your younger self about what you've learned, And it was, I said, just shut up and listen. I would have told myself that, like, I didn't listen enough. And sometimes if you ask my wife, I still don't, right?
She said that.
She did. I want to solve things. I think I have to swoop in and like know the answers, but people just sometimes want to sit beside you, and your job is to just listen. You don't have to have the answers. So I love that piece. And just to add that one little additional piece that you brought up about fears and motivation. To understand that, though, you have to listen. So
I love that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to be using that in my morning message to my staff tomorrow. I love the way you phrased it, and I think it's perfect for a daily basis, a daily reminder.
You mean the
I love that because
part?
Yeah, that too.
one of the things you guys asked earlier was, how do leaders begin to bring design thinking into their culture? And I think that's it right there. Like you start with those little practices, because we don't realize as adults how much, like you think like now, like, you go through 18 plus years of school, what that environment really does to your mindset. And how you approach things. Like, we are taught to come up with answers. We are taught to solve things quickly, move on to the next thing. Where the grading system, in terms of how it is not a system that helps you grow up to feel like it's okay to say, I don't know. It's not a system that encourages you to say, yeah, I'm actually not really good at that. Like, it's okay that I got an F here, but I got an A here. Like, I'm just going to be allowed to focus on this. Like, it's a system that expects perfection over progression. And so I think there's a lot of self-awareness work that takes place. There's a lot of like unlearning that has to take place. But one of the things that I do sort of encourage is something that I share in like the research is like, one of the outcomes is really building a culture of trust and collaboration amongst educators. I think a lot of times, educators are not in a place where they are either included into this decision-making process. A lot of times we don't listen and lean in. Sort of like I remember when I was a teacher, it was constantly somebody just telling me what to do versus me being able to collaborate with my peers to design those solutions. So I think as leaders, we take a lot more on ourselves than perhaps we need to. And it can be balanced out more by co-designing, not just with educators, but with students as well. These days, I have to tell you, I am incredibly humbled by student voices. And it's just like, wow, like, why are we sitting here talking about this when they have a lot of the answers? And it's our job to really work on that implementation and creating those environments. And so that's the co-design is where I would love to see people go.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you still have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Sprint to Success with Design Thinking community.